Hello everyone, my name is Owen, and welcome to the 8th episode of Magic Monday, where I talk about anything and everything related to the popular trading card game, Magic the Gathering. Seeing as the first deck tech I did was pretty well received by you guys, I've decided that I'll make another. This week's episode is going to be about another deck that I play with a lot, and really enjoy. This deck is called Go Wide or Go Home, and it's headed by Brutaclad Telcor Engineer. The goal of this deck is to create a ton of small tokens, then transform them into crazy massive creatures, ultimately making for some wacky and goofy shenanigans. This deck is going to be divided into a couple of categories to make it a bit easier to follow along with, so let's get right into it. Starting out with our commander, we have Brutaclad Telcor Engineer. Brutaclad is by far the most important part of our deck, providing the powerful ability to transform our tokens into other tokens at the beginning of combat. This ability is super important since it allows us to turn our smaller tokens, such as the 2/1 mirrors that Brutaclad makes, into bigger threats that can help us win the game. On top of this, he gives all of our tokens haste, which can really help when we need to attack with these tokens. We've established that we're going to be making tokens, but we haven't talked about how. Lucky for us, we've got a couple of cards that are perfect for the job. Starting out, there's Dragon Fodder, which makes 2 1/1 goblins for 2 mana, and Hordling Outburst, which makes 3 1/1 goblins for 3 mana. We can also make goblins with Kuldotha Rebirth, a 1 mana sorcery that makes us 3 goblins if we sacrifice an artifact. For more early game tokens, we also have Hard Evidence, which creates a 0/3 crab and a clue token for only 1 mana. Getting into the more consistent methods of making tokens, we have Sai Master Thopterist and Mirrodin Besieged, both of which allow us to create a 1/1 when we cast an artifact. We also have Trading Post, which on top of being able to make tokens, can also get our artifacts back from the graveyard and draw us cards. Next, we have a fresh face with Ovika Enigma Goliath. Though she may cost a lot, she can also make us tons of creatures if we play the right spells, and serves as a big blocker if need be. Finally, there's Brass's Bounty, a 7 mana sorcery that makes treasure tokens equal to the number of lands we control. This card can make an absolute buttload of treasures in the right situations, which can be used for mana, or we can transform them into something bigger and more scary. All of these tokens sure are great, but what are we going to do with them? Well, if they aren't any good as they are, then we'll just change them. This leads perfectly into our next category. This category consists of the big, scary creatures that we'll be turning our tokens into using Brutaclad's ability. First up in this category, we have the star of the deck, my personal favorite card ever, Wormcoil Engine. This card already provides tons of value on its own, as a big and hard to challenge attacker, but even more so if we have 10 token copies of it. Its on-death ability also makes it really hard to remove, since if somebody kills it, it just adds more tokens to our board. We also have Bane of Balajed, which whenever it attacks, has the defending player exile 2 of their permanents. This card is absolutely brutal if we copy it, and can completely decimate people's boards, since it can also exile lands. We also have Darksteel Juggernaut, a 5 mana artifact with Indestructible that gets bigger for each artifact we control. Since we're making tons of tokens, which are usually artifacts, this creature can get really big, so when we copy it, we get a massive Indestructible army. We also have some less crazy creatures that can still provide a bunch of value if we make them into tokens, such as Junkwinder and Mech Titan Core. Junkwinder lets us tap a creature whenever we make a token, so if we make copies of it, we can be tapping down entire boards every turn. The tapped cards also don't untap on their controller's next untap step, so if played right, we can lock the game in place until we can find a way to win. Mech Titan Core, on the other hand, while not providing any value if copied, can create the fabled Mech Titan, a 10/10 with Flying, Vigilance, Trample, Lifelink, and Haste, and is one of the highest value copy targets in our deck. But wait, you may ask, Brutaclad can only turn tokens into other tokens. We can't make our tokens into these creatures as they are. And you would be totally correct, which is why we have the cards in this next category to help us out. For the beginning of this category, we have Cackling Counterpart and Quasi-Duplicate, both of which let us create a token copy of a creature we control and can be cast from the graveyard. Then we have Echo Storm, which can create a copy of an artifact we control, then copies itself for every time we've played our commander. There's also Replication Technique, which creates a copy of a permanent we control, but it has Demonstrate so we can do it twice. And Saheeli's Artistry, which can copy an artifact or a creature, but is a little bit more expensive than the others. The last of our non-permanent copy spells is by far the best though, being Rite of Replication. This crazy card can create a token copy of any creature, but if we kick it, it creates 5 token copies instead. So not only can we create tons of copies of a big creature we control, but we could also instead grab the best creature from any opponent's board and make it our own. Onto the permanents, there's Jin Gataxia's Progress Tyrant, which will counter our opponent's spells while copying ours, which is really helpful in slowing down the game when necessary. We also have Helm of the Host, an equipment that creates token copies of the equipped creature and makes them non-legendary. This allows us to copy our legendary creatures such as Ovika and Mech Titan, or even Brutaclad himself. Then there's Mimic Vat, which can imprint creatures onto itself and make token copies of them. These copies go away at the end of the turn, but if we transform our other tokens into the Mimic Vat creature, we can make permanent versions. Lastly, there's Mirrorworks, which says that whenever we cast an artifact, we can pay 2 to create a token copy of it. This recurring copy effect can help us a lot since most of our big creatures are also artifacts, so being able to copy them on ETB for 2 mana is super powerful. But all of this stuff we're casting is getting pretty expensive. How are we getting the mana? Fortunately, I've created this next category for just that reason. First up for this category, we have Arcane Signet and Sol Ring. Arcane Signet can tap for either blue or red, and Sol Ring lets us tap to make 2 colorless mana. Then there's Sky Diamond, which enters tapped and taps for a blue mana, and Fire Diamond, which does the same but for red mana. Keeping on track with the artifact ramp, we have Izzet Signet and Talisman of Creativity, both of which can tap for a blue or a red, but at a small cost. Next, there's Mindstone, which taps for a colorless but can also be sacrificed to draw a card. We also have Skyclave Relic, an artifact that taps for either blue or red, but if we kick it, we can get 2 token copies of it. This is great because not only can it provide ramp, but since the copies are tokens, we can use Brutaclad to turn our other tokens into those copies, giving us tons of mana. Moving away from the more conventional ramp, we have our 2 flip cards, Storm the Vault and Treasure Map. Storm the Vault has us create a treasure token whenever we deal combat damage to a player, and if we have 5 or more artifacts, it flips into Vault of Cataclan, which is basically Tolarian Academy. Treasure Map, on the other hand, lets us pay 1 and tap it to scry 1, but if we do this 3 times, it creates 3 treasure tokens and flips into Treasure Cove, allowing us to sacrifice a treasure to draw a card. Unfortunately, none of these cards do anything if they're just sitting in our deck, so I've included this next category to help fish them out. Card draw is almost never a bad thing, so we've got a couple of different options to help us fill up our hands. For consistent draw, we have Bident of Thassa and Thopter Spy Network, both of which allow us to draw a card whenever a creature we control connects with an opponent. Thopter Spy Network also makes us Thopter tokens, helping us fill up our board with small attackers. We also have Padim, Consul of Innovation, which says that on our upkeep, if we control the artifact with the highest CMC, we draw a card. This will happen often since we have a lot of costly artifacts that we will frequently be playing. He also gives our artifacts hexproof, protecting our board from opposing threats. Then there's Unexpected Windfall and Pirate's Pillage, both of which let us draw 2 cards and make 2 treasure tokens at the cost of discarding a card. We also have Prismari Command, which on top of letting us draw, can also serve as removal. Then there's Thought Monitor, a 7-mana creature which lets us draw 2 cards on ETB, but it has affinity for artifacts, so we can usually cast it for really cheap. Finally, we have One with the Machine, an amazing card that lets us draw cards equal to the highest CMC and artifacts we control. This already is great, but since our commander is an artifact, we'll usually be drawing at least 6 cards, if not even more. While we're busy pumping out massive armies of crazy creatures, we leave ourselves pretty vulnerable to our opponent's threats. So to remedy this, I've included a variety of different removal and counterspells. Starting out with the targeted removal, we have Chaos Warp, a card that allows us to shuffle a permanent into its owner's library, but they get to play the top card of their library for free if it's a permanent. Then there's Raven Form, which lets us exile an artifact or creature an opponent controls and give them a 1/1 Raven token. It also has Foretell, so we can cast it preemptively for cheaper if we need to. In terms of mass removal, we have Blasphemous Act, a 9-mana board wipe that costs 1 less for each creature on the battlefield, and Vandal Blast, a 1-sided artifact board wipe. We also have some counterspells, leading with the one and only Counterspell, letting us counter any spell for 2 mana. There's also Muddle the Mixture, which can counter an instant or sorcery, but also tutor our library for any 2-mana card. Finally, tying right back into the theme of tokens, we have Spell Swindle, which for 5 mana can counter a spell, and we get treasure tokens equal to that spell's converted mana cost. I wasn't really sure how to transition into this category, but we also have a couple of Planeswalkers in the deck, so here they are. Starting out, we have Saheeli the Gifted, who can make tokens, but also makes our spells cheaper for each artifact we control. This can help us cast big artifacts as well as our commander for really cheap. Then there's our second Saheeli, the original Saheeli Rai, who can help us create copies of creatures that we want to turn into tokens. Guess what, everyone? We have another Saheeli, this time being Saheeli Sublime Artificer. Similar to Sai Master Thopterist, she can make us tokens whenever we cast a non-creature spell, but she can also help us copy our creatures. Last up, we have our only non-Saheeli Planeswalker, Karn Scion of Urza. Not only can this guy make powerful construct tokens, but he also gives us massive card advantage as long as we can keep him alive. All of these Planeswalkers can provide us with tons of value and a huge card advantage, so be sure to keep them alive as long as possible. As with any good deck, there will always be some cards that just don't fit into any particular category, but even so, they're all powerful in their own ways, so don't count them out just yet. First up, we have Arkham Dagson, who lets us sacrifice an artifact creature, then tutor a library for an artifact and put it onto the battlefield. Funny enough, the next card is usually the card that I most commonly tutor for, that being Darksteel Forge. This powerful card gives all of our artifacts indestructible, including our commander, meaning that any threats that we put out are going to be really hard to deal with. Speaking of protection, we're also running Lightning Greaves, which when we equip it to our commander, will give it Shroud and Haste. For more tutors, we're running Trophy Mage and Treasure Mage, which each let us search our library for artifacts of various different mana costs. Next, we have Tamiyo's Journal, which creates a clue token on every upkeep, and if we sacrifice 3 clues, we can tutor any card to our hand. Since we can easily make all of our tokens into clues, this effect can trigger almost every turn. Then there's Muzio Visionary Architect, who can get artifacts off the top of our library straight onto the battlefield, for the low price of 4 mana. Finally, we're running Mirror Box, a card which says that the legendary rule doesn't apply to creatures we control, meaning that we can create token copies of creatures like Mech Titan, Ovika, and Jin-Gataxias. Similar to the last deck tech I did, I won't be talking about the lands too much, but in this deck there are a couple of must-have lands that I'd like to show you. First, both the red and blue artifact lands are great, since not only do they count towards affinity to artifacts, but can also be copied by stuff like Echo Storm and Saheeli's Artistry if you want to turn your tokens into lands. Then there's the red and blue channel lands from Neon Dynasty, as they can function as normal lands as well as giving good value if you need them to. Finally, I'd like to include Kirk Keep, since it can make you tokens. Don't really need to say much more about that. If you want to see the full list of lands as well as all of the other cards, the deck list will be down in the description. Feel free to take a peek. Now that we've finished going over the cards, let's tally up the price. This deck totals out to a solid $294 on TCG Player. It's a lot better than our last deck, but still not a budget deck by any means. This deck may be a bit pricey, but it's still extremely fun and silly, so be sure to tell me your thoughts on it in the comments below. Alas, we must end the video. I really hope that you enjoyed this week's episode, as well as the deck that came with it. If you do choose to build this deck, please tell me what you think of it. I'm really excited to see what you guys think. Also, feel free to like and subscribe. It really helps keep the ideas flowing. So, to all of you still here, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all next week.